When the eternal warrior tears through reality and crashes into the sacred desert, even prophecy starts to fracture. The spice glows wrong. The worms scream in languages older than sand. Hell has learned to wear divinity like a mask, and it wants every mind that touches the stars. So what happens when the one thing demons fear arrives in a world they've already begun to claim? The dimensional fault opened above the deep desert like a wound in heaven itself, a rupture of pure violence that split the copper sky with light the color of burning blood. The tear hung suspended over the Great Flat, 40 kilometers from Sietch Tabor, visible to every Fremen scout who stood watch from the high dunes. It made no sound. It simply existed, defying the natural order of Arrakis with the authority of something that had broken reality before and would break it again. Through that impossible aperture fell a single figure, wreathed in emerald flame that did not consume, did not fade, that burned with a fury older than the Imperium itself. He struck the sand with such force that the dune collapsed inward, a crater of glass forming where superheated silica fused beneath the impact. The figure rose slowly, and the scouts who watched through long lenses saw armor the color of old bronze and moss, scarred by wars that had no name in this universe. They saw the bulk of something that moved like a man but carried the mass of judgment itself. And they saw, clutched in one gauntleted fist, a weapon that resembled no lasgun or mauler pistol ever forged by human hands. The Fremen named him Shai Gara, the Silent Maker, the thing that walks but does not speak. But he was not silent in purpose. He was hunting. 300 kilometers to the north, in the industrial sprawl of Carthage where Harkonnen power concentrated like a tumor on the face of Arrakis, the spice refineries began to scream, not with human voices, though those would come, with something deeper. The machinery itself, the great processing towers that rendered melange into its purest form, started to resonate at frequencies that shattered plasteel and drove workers to their knees. Overseers found their subordinates clawing at their own faces, babbling in languages that predated human speech. The spice itself, stored in massive silos, began to glow with an inner light that was not the soft luminescence of melange but something sharper, hungrier, wrong. Reverend Mother Eliana stood in the observation tower of the Bene Gesserit sanctuary in Arrakeen and felt it through the layers of other memory, through the voices of 10,000 generations of mothers who dwelled in her consciousness, a presence, invasive, malignant, something that had learned to wear the spice like a mask, to thread itself through the psychoactive properties of melange and reach into the minds of all who consumed it. She pressed her palm against the window, feeling the subtle vibration that ran through all things now, a frequency of corruption that the desert had never known. She spoke a single word in the language of the Missionaria Protectiva, the secret tongue that shaped belief across worlds. Abomination. But this was not the abomination of a pre-born child possessed by ancestral memory. This was something that came from outside the chain of human consciousness entirely, something that had found in the spice network a perfect vehicle for possession on a galactic scale. Every guild navigator who swam in spice gas, every mentat who sharpened focus with sappho juice, every Fremen who had lived their entire lives saturated in the essence of the worm, all of them now stood at the threshold of invasion by something that the mothers in her mind recognized with primal terror. They called it by many names across the ages of memory. Shaitan, adversary, devourer. Hell had come to Arrakis. The Doomslayer moved across the sand with purpose that needed no map, no guide. He followed the resonance that leaked from the fault lines between dimensions, the signature of demonic presence that he had tracked across infinity. Here it manifested differently, not in the towering fortresses of bone and screaming metal that he knew, but in the subtle corruption of a substance that this universe considered holy, the spice. He had seen its equivalent before, in the seraphic energies of Urdak, in the argent frequencies of Mars, power that opened doors in consciousness, power that made vessels of those who partook, perfect for possession. His armor's systems, integrated with technology that merged UAC engineering and maker artifice, detected the contamination immediately. The spice fields glowed in his visor's overlay with the sickly purple-green of hell's taint. Beneath the sand, something vast stirred, not the sandworms of this world, though those massive creatures registered as well. Something else. Something that had ridden the dimensional breach and embedded itself in the planetary consciousness, learning to interface with the greatest predators of Arrakis. A spice factory erupted 40 kilometers ahead, a pillar of green fire that clawed at the sky. The Slayer began to run. He moved faster than human physiology should allow, each stride carrying him across meters of shifting sand that would have trapped any other traveler. The Praetor suit, enhanced by the Seraphim's blessing and tempered in battles against the armies of the damned, made him more than mortal, made him myth incarnate. Behind him, the dimensional tear began to pulse with gathering energy. More would come. Hell always sent more. Fremen outriders found him an hour before sunset. 3 scouts mounted on smaller maker hooks, positioned to observe this stranger who ran through the deep desert as if it were his native ground. They followed at a distance, reporting in the battle language of finger signals and mirror flashes. What they saw defied their understanding of possible. The stranger did not pause for rest, did not check for worm's sign, did not show any recognition of the dangers that saturated every meter of open sand. When the worm came, rising from depths that should have warned anything with survival instinct, they expected the stranger to die. Instead, he turned, planted his feet, and raised the weapon he carried. The discharge was not Alaskan's coherent beam, but something primal, a roar of superheated plasma that struck the sandworm's maw with enough force to vaporize the first 10 meters of its body. The creature, ancient and vast, recoiled in agony and confusion, diving back into the sand in full retreat. The Slayer resumed running toward the burning factory. The scouts signaled for immediate counsel. One returned to Tab with news that would reach Stilgar before moonrise. The other 2 followed, compelled by the same fascination that made young Fremen test themselves against the impossible. They wanted to see what this stranger hunted. They wanted to understand what could make a creature of the deep desert flee. At the Harkonnen factory, the workers had become something else. The spice had transformed them, not with the slow mutations of guild navigators, but with immediate and violent possession. Their eyes blazed with inner fire, pupils blown wide and glowing with balefire. They tore at each other and themselves, clawing at flesh to remake it, to sculpt human bodies into forms more suitable for entities that had never known human limitation. Blood and melange mixed on the processing floors, creating sigils that would have driven a mentat to madness with their geometric impossibility. The factory complex itself was transforming. Spice residue that coated every surface began to crystallize into structures that resembled organic technology, Hell's biomechanical architecture expressing itself through the medium of melange. Walls grew teeth. Machinery sprouted limbs that ended in claws. The central processing tower warped into a spire that reached toward the dimensional fault above, a beacon calling for reinforcement. The Doomslayer arrived as the first true demon manifested. It pulled itself through a worker who had consumed enough contaminated spice to become a suitable gateway, tearing free of human flesh in an explosion of gore and transmuted matter. The imp stood 3 meters tall, hunched and snarling, its body radiating heat that turned sand to glass. It saw the Slayer approaching and shrieked recognition, a sound that carried across Hell's infinite networks. The destroyer, the betrayer, the one who could not be stopped. It died before the echo faded, the super shotgun reducing its skull to fragments with a discharge that lit the desert twilight. The Slayer did not slow. He walked through the factory gates as more workers turned hosts rushed him, their humanity burned away by the entities that rode their nervous systems. Each one died with brutal efficiency, plasma burns, kinetic impacts, explosive fragmentation. The Slayer moved through them like scripture through a heretic's argument, implacable and absolute. The Fremen scouts who had followed watched from a nearby ridge, their water discipline forgotten as ore dried their mouths. This was not combat as they understood it, this was extermination, religious in its totality. They saw the stranger move through rooms of possessed workers, saw bodies fall in his wake like wheat before the harvester's blade. They saw him tear through the corrupted machinery with his bare hands, ripping apart structures that should have required demolition charges. And they saw, in the pattern of his violence, something that resembled the drawings in the oldest caves of Sietch Tabr, the pictographs of ancient Fremen who had painted their myths on stone. The figure that walked through fire, the judge who knew no mercy, the hand of God against the unclean. Inside the central tower, the Slayer found what he sought, a breach point, a wound in reality where hell had begun to anchor itself, using the spice network as neural tissue to spread its influence. The air around it distorted with psychoactive pressure, concentrated melange vapor mixing with demonic frequencies to create a zone of altered consciousness. Anyone who approached would be compromised, possessed, or driven to terminal madness. The Slayer walked into it without pause. His armor flared with protective energies, argent shields interfacing with the Praetor suit's systems to create a barrier against corruption. He saw the breach clearly now, a vertical slash in space-time that pulsed with Hell's signature crimson. Around it, more imps were materializing, along with larger forms. Soldiers, Hell Knights. The invasion was accelerating, using the factory as a staging ground for something larger. Through the dimensional link, deeper entities observed, calculating, preparing to commit greater forces once the beachhead proved stable. The Slayer loaded a BFG round and fired into the breach's heart. The resulting detonation consumed the entire tower. Argent energy, weaponized and concentrated, met the dimensional fault and forced it closed through sheer annihilating power. The blast wave vaporized everything within 100 meters and sent a shockwave rolling across the desert that the Fremen scouts felt as pressure in their bones. The tower collapsed into a crater that glowed with residual radiation. Melange stores ignited in secondary explosions, and the possessed workers who had not yet died simply ceased, their animating force severed from its source. Silence returned to the desert. The Slayer stood at the crater's edge, systems already scanning for the next corruption point. His motion tracker indicated 2 watching presences on the ridgeline. He marked them as non-hostile observers and dismissed them from tactical consideration. They were not his mission. The breach was closed, but the contamination remained. He could feel it, spreading through the planetary spice network like poison through veins. More factories would fall, more people would become hosts, and eventually, if left unchecked, the entities that whispered through the melange would reach the guild navigators in orbit, the Bene Gesserit sanctuaries, the Imperial throne itself. He began walking toward the next target, 70 kilometers southeast, another factory, another breach point. Behind him, the 2 Fremen scouts began their journey back to the Sietch, their report already forming. They would tell Stilgar what they witnessed. They would tell him that the old prophecies spoke truth, that in the time of greatest trial, when the desert itself became possessed by Shaitan, a warrior would come who knew the demon's true name, a warrior who carried the fire of judgment in his hands. They did not know that this warrior had been fighting their prophesied battle for eons, that every mythology and every culture that spoke of a divine executioner against darkness drew from the same source, echoes of a truth that Hell's enemies carried across dimensions. The Doomslayer was the prototype of their prophecy, the template that filtered through collective consciousness and became hope. and he would burn through their world until every trace of hell was ashes. In Arrakeen, Paul Atreides woke from a vision that left his sheets soaked with sweat and his mind screaming with prescient overload. He had seen the desert burning. He had seen the worms transformed into vessels of something that negated prophecy itself, that existed outside the branching paths of possible futures. He had seen a figure in green armor standing atop a mountain of demon corpses, and in that vision he understood with terrible clarity that this figure was both salvation and apocalypse. That the arrival of this stranger would force the Kwisatz Haderach into choices that no future path had prepared him for. His mother, the Lady Jessica, found him moments later, her Bene Gesserit training reading his state immediately. She had felt the disturbance too, filtered through her own awareness. Every sister on Arrakis had felt it. The presence of something that operated outside their centuries of genetic manipulation and social engineering. An element that could not be controlled or predicted. "What did you see?" she asked, though she knew already from his expression that the answer would reshape everything. Paul looked at his hands, still trembling from the vision's intensity, and spoke words that came not from his training but from something deeper, from the collective unconscious that prescient awareness tapped. "The Desert War," he said. "Not the war we planned, not the jihad that spreads my name across stars, something older, the first war, the war that never ends." Against whom? Against everything. Jessica felt the truth of it through her own training, through the pattern recognition that made the Bene Gesserit what they were. This stranger, this shy Gara, represented something their order had never encountered, a force that had no place in their breeding programs or political schemes, something that existed solely to destroy that which could not be tolerated. And Hell, having learned of the Spice Network's potential, would send everything it possessed to claim this prize. Arrakis would become the battlefield, the desert would run with blood and ichor, and every faction that struggled for control of the spice would be forced to choose sides in a conflict they barely comprehended. "Send word to Stilgar," Paul said, rising from his bed with the mechanical purpose of one who had seen what must be done. "Tell him to gather the Fedaykin. Tell him we ride at dawn to find this stranger. If the visions speak truth, we'll need him, or we'll need to stop him. Either way, we cannot let this proceed without understanding." Jessica moved to obey, but paused at the doorway, looking back at her son with an expression caught between pride and sorrow. "The Reverend Mother warned us about wild variables," she said softly, "about factors that could invalidate the entire plan. I think we've found one." "Then the plan changes," Paul replied, his voice carrying the weight of futures collapsing into a single narrow path. "We adapt, or we die. The desert has always taught us that." But in his mind, the vision repeated. The figure in green armor, the demons rising from infected sand, the worms screaming in languages that broke human comprehension, and himself, standing at the convergence point, forced to choose between the future he had seen and the annihilation of everything if that future proved false. The Doomslayer had brought war to Arrakis, but war was what Paul Atreides understood best. And if this stranger from beyond the stars thought he could burn through the desert without consequence, without encountering those who had made the desert their weapon and their faith, he would learn that prophecy on Arrakis carried teeth. Dawn came hard and bright across the deep desert, and with it came the realization that 3 more factories had burned through the night. The Harkonnen Baron, orbiting above in his private frigate, received reports of losses that exceeded his capacity for rage. Entire processing facilities reduced to craters, workers found transformed into things that defied biological classification. And everywhere, the contaminated spice glowed with that wrong light, forcing his people to quarantine entire silos for fear of whatever plague or weapon had been deployed. He blamed the Atreides. He blamed Fremen saboteurs, He blamed everyone but the truth, because the truth did not fit his understanding of possible. The Baron dealt in politics and economics and violence, but always human violence, always comprehensible threats. What walked through his holdings now operated on principles that his mentat advisors could not calculate. In the Spacing Guild highliner that hung in high orbit, a navigator named Edric felt the contamination through the spice gas that sustained his transformed body. The taint was there, subtle but growing, threading through the melange like poison through wine. He saw futures collapsing, paths closing, the certainty of guild navigation becoming uncertainty. Something was interfering with the prescient abilities that made space travel possible. Something that wanted those abilities for itself. He sent emergency communication to guild headquarters, a message that traveled faster than light through technology that depended on the very spice now being compromised. The guild would respond. They would send investigators, but it would take time, and time was what Hell specialized in exploiting. The Doomslayer reached the 4th factory complex at noon, the sun a hammer against the sand. This facility was larger, more heavily defended, built into the side of a rock formation that provided structural support and protection from the worst of the desert storms. Harkonnen guards patrolled the perimeter, armed with lasguns and stunners, trained soldiers who held their positions with professional discipline. The Slayer did not deviate from his approach vector, did not attempt stealth or subterfuge. He walked toward the main gate with the inevitability of tides, visible to every guard who looked outward. They saw him, called challenges, raised weapons, and when he did not stop, they fired. Lasgun beams struck his shields and dissipated into harmless light. Stunner fields washed over him and failed to connect with his nervous system. The guards, trained to respond to threats within their experience, found themselves confronting something that their training had not prepared them for. Panic spread through their ranks faster than any order could counter. Some held position and continued firing. Others broke and ran. A few veterans of the desert wars recognized the futility and simply stood aside, unwilling to die for a facility that was already doomed. The Slayer walked through the gate and into the complex proper, where the transformation was already far advanced. The factory interior had become a fusion of industrial architecture and organic nightmare. Spice processing equipment grew tendrils of corrupted flesh. Walls breathed. The air itself thickened with psychoactive pressure that would have driven an unprotected human to madness. Possessed workers moved through this transformed space like drones in a hive, their individuality consumed by the collective will of entities that used them as extensions, and in the central chamber, where the largest spice stores were kept, something greater was manifesting. A Hell Priest. One of the high demons that specialized in corruption and possession, that served as anchors for Hell's influence in contested dimensions. It stood 4 meters tall, robed in what might have been fabric or might have been flayed skin, its face hidden behind a mask of bone that pulsed with runic inscription. Around it, the possessed workers knelt in worship, their voices raised in chants that harmonized at frequencies designed to weaken dimensional barriers. The Hell Priest saw the Slayer enter and smiled behind its mask, a gesture that translated across form. It had been waiting, expecting. This was the game Hell played, the eternal contest between corruption and destruction. The priests knew the Slayer would come. That was why they had positioned themselves at key breach points, why they had invested their presence into making these footholds permanent. If they could delay him, could force him to fight through layers of possessed and demon guard, could exhaust even his legendary endurance, then Hell would gain the time needed to complete the infestation. The priest raised one withered hand and spoke in a voice that carried harmonics meant to induce paralysis and despair. Slayer, betrayer of your own kind, do you understand what we have found here? This substance, this spice, It is conscious thought made tangible. Every mind that touches it becomes a gateway. Every navigator who swims in it becomes ours. This entire imperium, this web of worlds, it will fall to us not through invasion but through possession. They will open the doors themselves, begging for the transcendence we offer. The Doomslayer's response was to load a precision bolt round and fire it through the Hell Priest's skull. The demon's head exploded in a spray of ichor and flame, its body staggering backward, robes suddenly empty of animating force. But it did not die. Hell Priests were anchored too deeply, their essence distributed across their area of influence. The body reconstituted, pulling itself back together from the corrupted spice that saturated the room. It laughed, a sound like tearing metal. "You see, we have learned, Slayer. Learned from our defeats. Learned to make ourselves immortal within the systems we corrupt. Kill this body. We'll make another. Destroy this facility. We have seeded dozens more. You cannot win. You can only delay. And while you fight, the spice flows to 1 billion mouths, 1 billion new hosts." The Slayer holstered the precision rifle and drew the crucible. The energy blade ignited with a sound like reality, screaming, pure argent power forged into a weapon that could sever anything from its animating force. The Hell Priest's confidence fractured. It raised its hands to summon Demon Guard, to pull imps and soldiers through the local breach points, to bury the Slayer in bodies until even his rage ran dry. But the Slayer had fought Hell Priests before, had learned their weaknesses through countless iterations. The blade swept down, not at the demon itself but at the geometric patterns traced in mixed spice and blood on the chamber floor, the sigils that anchored the Hell Priest's distributed consciousness. The crucible's edge cut through them like causality through falsehood, severing the connection between demon and domain. The Hell Priest screamed as its immortality stripped away. Suddenly it was just flesh again, just a single body vulnerable to destruction. The Slayer's next strike took it at the waist, the crucible passing through demonic matter with no resistance at all. The upper and lower halves fell in opposite directions, already burning from the inside with argent fire that consumed every trace of Hell's essence. Around the chamber, the possessed workers collapsed, freed from external control but too damaged to survive. The corrupted architecture began to decay, melange crystallization reverting to simple powder. The breach point in the ceiling flickered and died, its anchor destroyed. The Slayer moved through the facility with methodical purpose, finding and eliminating every demon that had manifested, every possessed worker beyond saving, every structural element that showed signs of transformation. By the time he emerged, the sun had shifted 3 degrees across the sky and the factory was a burning ruin behind him. But his armor's sensors showed that the local contamination was purged. This facility would seed no more corruption. This breach would summon no more demons. 12 factories remained, 12 points where Hell had established presence. The Slayer marked them in his HUD and began calculating the most efficient route to hit them all before the pattern shifted, before Hell adapted its strategy. He was halfway to the next target when the sandworm found him. But this was not a natural worm, no ancient child of Shai Hulud following the rhythms of the deep desert. This was transformation made manifest, a worm that had consumed corrupted spice and been remade by the entities that rode the melange network. Its body stretched 300 meters, but portions of that flesh had warped into biomechanical armor, into structures that resembled carapace and weaponry. Its mouth, large enough to swallow a harvester whole, glowed from within with balefire, and its presence in the sand was wrong. The drumming thumper rhythm replaced by something that sounded like industrial machinery, like the pulse of Hell's own heart. The Slayer saw it coming through seismic sensors, saw the anomalous readings that marked it as corrupted. He planted his feet and waited, BFG charging in his hands, as the infected worm breached the surface in a fountain of sand and alien intention. The blast caught it in the mouth. argent energy detonating against biomechanical corruption in an explosion that lit the desert like a small sun. The worm's forward segments vaporized, 20 meters of body reduced to component atoms. But it did not die, did not retreat. The wound closed with unnatural speed, flesh knitting together in seconds, and the worm continued its attack with the single-minded purpose of a thing that knew no pain, only obedience to the will that commanded it. The slayer dove aside as the worm plunged back into the sand, rolled to his feet, and immediately armed the Gauss cannon. When the worm emerged again, he fired siege rounds into its midsection, kinetic penetrators that punched through armor and flesh to explode internally. The worm thrashed, its immense body coiling across the dunes, but still, it did not flee, could not flee. Whatever possessed it had overridden every survival instinct, had made it a weapon aimed at the only threat hell truly feared. 3 more worms breached the surface, all corrupted, all moving with coordinated purpose. The slayer found himself in the center of a killing circle, massive bodies converging from multiple vectors, each one a living siege weapon that could crush him through mass alone if they connected. He activated the equipment launcher and fired an ice bomb at the nearest worm's mouth, the device detonating in a cascade of supercooled gas that froze tissue solid. Before the worm could recover, he switched to the rocket launcher and sent a barrage of remote detonation missiles into the frozen flesh. The explosions ripped through the worm's body, and this time when the segments fell, they did not regenerate. The cold had disrupted whatever demonic healing factor animated them. 2 more worms converged. The slayer ran perpendicular to their approach, forcing them to adjust vectors, buying himself seconds to reload and reassess. His armor's power levels read 70%. The BFG had 3 rounds remaining. The crucible held charge enough for a dozen more strikes. He calculated odds and outcomes with the cold precision of something that had survived 10,000 years of combat, not through luck, but through brutal efficiency. The worms struck together, a synchronized attack that left no room for evasion. The slayer did not try to evade. He activated the flame belch, coating himself in a nimbus of superheated projection, and leaped directly at the nearest worm's mouth. His armored form struck corrupted flesh, and the impact drove him deep into the creature's gullet, into the burning interior where acids and demonic augmentation fought for control of biological systems. From inside, he drew the crucible and began cutting. The worm's body erupted in sections, massive wounds opening from internal attacks it had no defense against. The slayer carved his way through organs and bone, through flesh that tried to heal and augmentation that tried to stop him, leaving a trail of argent fire in his wake. When he emerged from the worm's far end in a spray of ichor and burning meat, the creature was already dying, its body going rigid as essential systems failed. The remaining 2 worms faltered, the collective intelligence that guided them recognizing threat in a way their corrupted flesh could not process. They hesitated. It was enough. The slayer targeted the nearest one's eye with a precision plasma shot, the superheated bolt burning through to the primitive brain and ending coordination. That worm thrashed in death spasms, its body carving random furrows in the sand. The last worm dove deep, retreating into the desert's depths, driven by some remnant of self-preservation that hell's control had not fully erased. The slayer stood among the corpses of transformed makers, breathing steady despite exertion that would have killed normal men, and reassessed the tactical situation. If hell could corrupt the sandworms, could turn them into weapons, then the entire desert ecology became a potential army. Every worm that consumed contaminated spice would become an asset for the invasion. The problem was no longer just factories and breach points. The problem was planetary. He needed to locate the primary anchor, the central breach from which all others derived, needed to destroy it at the source. But finding it would require information he did not possess, knowledge of Arrakis's spice network and geological structure that exceeded his current intelligence gathering. He needed assistance. And approaching on the horizon, visible now in the afternoon heat shimmer, came those who might provide it. Paul Atreides rode at the head of a Fremen war party, 40 of the Fedaykin mounted on captured Harkonnen equipment, their still suits and desert robes marking them as natives in a way no off-worlder could fake. They approached cautiously, weapons ready but not aimed, their formation designed to allow rapid dispersion if the stranger proved hostile. Paul himself rode in the lead position, blue within blue eyes scanning the stranger and the dead worms with an intensity that went beyond normal observation. He had seen this moment in his visions, had watched it unfold across 1,000 variations, and in 90% of those variations, this encounter ended in violence that served no one. But in the remaining 10%, in that narrow band of possibility, this meeting became the pivot on which the war would turn. The war party halted 20 meters from the Slayer, maintaining combat distance, and Paul dismounted with the fluid grace of one who had lived 15 years on the desert. He walked forward alone, against every protocol of protection, and stopped 5 meters from the armored figure. "You are Shaigara," Paul said, using the Fremen name, speaking in a voice that carried the multiple awareness of prescience and mentat training. "The Silent Maker, the one who burns Shaitan. I am Muad'Dib, the one who knows the way, the mouse that knows the desert's secrets, and I tell you now that if you continue as you have, you will destroy this world trying to save it." The Doomslayer regarded him with a gaze that registered only as threat assessment, as tactical evaluation of potential hostile or asset. He said nothing. His silence was not contempt but focus, the absolute concentration of something that had refined purpose until nothing else remained. Paul felt the weight of that silence, felt the vast history behind it that his prescience could only glimpse. This being had fought across dimensions that human consciousness could not map, had waged war against forces that made the Spacing Guild's prescience look like children reading tea leaves, and he had been doing it for so long that language itself had become unnecessary, burned away in the fires of eternal combat. "You hunt demons," Paul continued, his voice steady despite the weight of futures he saw collapsing around this moment. "We know. We have felt them in the spice. But the spice is not just a substance. It is the basis of our civilization. It grants prescience. It allows space travel. It sustains the navigators and awakens the mind. If you destroy every factory, every silo, every grain that carries contamination, you will strand humanity across 1,000 worlds with no way to reunite them. You will cause a dark age that makes the Butlerian Jihad look like an inconvenience." The Slayer's head tilted fractionally, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been nothing. His hand remained on his weapon, ready to draw and fire if this conversation proved to be a delaying tactic. "But if we do nothing," Paul said, and now his voice carried the weight of prophetic certainty, "if we allow the contamination to spread, then every mind that touches the spice becomes a doorway, and what comes through those doorways will be worse than any dark age. I have seen it. I have watched the navigators transform into something that pilots ships not between stars but between dimensions, bringing hell itself into the heart of the Imperium. I have seen the Emperor possessed on his golden lion throne, speaking in tongues that unmake sanity. I have seen worlds burn." He took one step closer, close enough now that a normal human would be well within the Slayer's kill radius. "So I offer you this alliance, temporary and focused. You know how to kill demons. We know this world. We know where the spice flows and why. Together we can find the source of this infection and end it without destroying the substance that holds civilization together. We can be surgical instead of apocalyptic." Paul paused, reading the micro-expressions that showed even through armor, the minute shifts that revealed decision processes in a being that had learned to communicate through violence alone. "Or you can continue alone," Paul finished quietly, "and I will have no choice but to see you as a threat to my people's survival, and I will do what I have always done to such threats. I will end you, or I will die trying." The silence stretched between them, heavy with potential futures, with decisions that would cascade across worlds. The Fedaykin watched from their formation, hands on weapons, ready to support their leader or to witness his death and carry word back to the Sietch. The sun beat down on the killing ground, where dead worms lay cooling, their corrupted flesh already beginning to attract the attention of carrion birds that circled high above. The Doomslayer lowered his weapon, not holstering it, but pointing it at the sand instead of at the boy who spoke with the certainty of one who had seen the branching paths of possibility. It was not surrender. It was calculation. This Muad'Dib spoke truth about the tactical situation. Alone, the Slayer could purge the surface contamination, but the network that Hell was building would adapt faster than he could destroy it. With local intelligence, with guides who understood the planetary infrastructure, the hunt could be more efficient. And efficiency was how wars were won. Paul saw the gesture and felt relief he did not allow to show on his face. In 10,000 possible variations, he had seen the Slayer reject this offer, and seen the resulting battle that left half the Fedaykin dead and himself mortally wounded. This was the narrow path, the dangerous cooperation of forces that should never have met, unified only by their shared understanding that what threatened them was greater than their differences. "Then come," Paul said, turning back toward his ride. "We go to Sietch Taba. There is a Reverend Mother there who has felt the contamination through other memory. She may know things that your instruments cannot detect. And there is equipment, salvaged from the Atreides invasion, that includes deep desert sensors that can map the spice network. If there is a central breach, a primary anchor, we will find it." The Slayer followed, his massive armored form drawing stares from the Fedaykin as he approached their formation. They had fought Harkonnen oppressors and Sardaukar shock troops, had survived battles that would have broken lesser warriors, but nothing in their experience prepared them for the presence of this stranger. He radiated purpose so absolute that it bent the space around him, made the air feel heavier, made breathing require conscious effort. Stilgar, the Naib of Sietch Taba, regarded the Slayer with the flat stare of one who would reserve judgment until action proved character. He spoke in Chakobsa, the battle language, words meant for Paul alone. "Is this wisdom or madness, Usul?" Paul replied in the same tongue, his voice carrying the weight of certainty that only prescience granted. "It is survival. Without him, we face demons we cannot kill. With him, we face the possibility that his methods will destroy what we fight to protect. Either way, the choice is made. The war has come. We can only decide how we fight it." Stilgar nodded once, accepting, and signaled the formation to move. They rode southeast toward the hidden Sietch, where 10,000 Fremen made their homes in caverns that went deep enough to touch the planetary aquifer that geology claimed did not exist. They rode in silence, weapons ready, alert for both worm sign and the new threat that had learned to wear the desert's greatest predators like clothing. Behind them, the sun began its descent toward the shield wall, and in the cooling air, the scent of spice mixed with something else, something that smelled like sulfur and burning metal. The scent of hell establishing its presence in a universe that had never known its touch. And in orbit, in the Spacing Guild Hayliner that had detected the dimensional anomalies, Navigator Edric floated in his tank of spice gas and felt the contamination spread through his transformed body. Felt entities whispering in frequencies that bypassed conscious thought. Felt his prescient awareness bend toward futures that his training said were impossible. Futures where ships navigated not by predicting safe paths through folded space, but by diving directly through hell itself, emerging at destinations that existed in nightmares. He tried to resist, tried to purge the contamination through meditation and mental discipline, but the spice was his life support, his transformation, his entire existence. He could not separate himself from it any more than he could separate himself from his own neurons. The entities that rode the melange rode him as well, patient and persistent, knowing that time was their ally, knowing that eventually every navigator in the guild would face the same choice: surrender or suffocate. Edric made his choice. He opened his mind fully to the voices and let them in, let them show him the futures they promised, futures of power beyond prescience. Futures where the guild controlled not just travel between stars, but travel between dimensions, between realities, where every possible universe became accessible to those with the courage to claim it. It was beautiful. It was logical. It was everything the guild had ever reached toward. It was also damnation, but by the time Edric realized that truth, he was no longer capable of caring. The entities that wore his consciousness looked through his eyes at the sprawl of guild operations around him and began calculating how many other navigators they could reach, how many other minds they could claim before humanity realized what was happening. Hell's invasion of Dune had just accelerated, and it was spreading upward, toward orbit, toward the Imperium itself. The Slayer, riding now in the back of a Fremen transport hauler that groaned under his weight, did not know these developments, but he felt them through the quantum-entangled awareness that came with his Sentinel armor's connection to Erdak's ruins. Felt the spread of corruption like heat against skin, like pressure building toward rupture. His HUD updated with new markers, new contamination signatures that appeared faster than he could reach them. The invasion was entering its next phase. The local breaches were just the beginning. Somewhere on this planet, Hell was building something greater. A primary anchor that would allow true demons to manifest, the higher entities that commanded legions and reshaped reality through their mere presence. Lords, titans, perhaps even one of the archdemons themselves, drawn by the unique opportunity that the Spice Network represented. If one of those manifested fully, the war would escalate beyond anything Arrakis could survive. The Slayer had fought such entities before, had brought down Hell's champions in battles that shattered moons. But those fights had taken place in the wastelands of already ruined dimensions, in places where collateral damage was meaningless because nothing remained to be saved. Here, billions of lives hung on the blade's edge between victory and extinction. The Slayer would need to be more than efficient. He would need to be perfect. And perfection in war was achieved not through individual prowess, but through complete understanding of the battlefield, through integration with local forces, through the transformation of separate armies into a single weapon aimed at the enemy's heart. He had done this before, in fragments, working with the UAC remnants on Mars, with the Night Sentinels in Argent D'Nur, with the refugees of Imora in Hell itself. But always as the outsider, the destroyer who arrived after civilizations had already fallen. Now he would need to do it preemptively, before the fall, working with people who still believed their world could be saved. It would require communication, strategy, trust. The Slayer was not certain he remembered how to do any of those things, but he would learn or he would fail, and failure was not acceptable. It never had been. Not since the moment he had found his world burning and his people dead and had made the choice that defined every moment after, the choice to never stop, never surrender, never allow Hell to claim another inch of existence without paying for it in blood and ash. Siege Tabor appeared on the horizon as the sun touched the shield wall, a cluster of rock formations that would have looked natural to any observer who did not know to look for the subtle signs of habitation, caves, catch pockets for moisture, the faint shimmer of wind traps. The Fremen had built their civilization in places that the Imperium's censors would dismiss as worthless geology, and in doing so had created a culture that could not be broken by orbital bombardment or surface assault. But Hell did not need to assault the surface. Hell learned to infiltrate through the substance the Fremen valued most, through the spice that was their gift and their curse. And if the contamination reached the Sietch's water stores, reached the deep caverns where Fremen children grew and mothers taught and warriors rested between battles, then all that hidden strength would become weakness. The Slayer disembarked from the hauler and followed Paul into the Sietch proper, through passages carved by human hands and time, deeper into the rock where temperature stabilized and moisture collected. The Fremen who passed them in the tunnels stared openly, their still-suit discipline forgotten in the presence of something that should not exist. Children hid behind mothers. Warriors touched their krisk knives in gestures that were half greeting and half warning. They descended 3 levels before reaching the chamber where the Reverend Mother waited, a space that had been carved to catch and concentrate sound, to serve as both meeting hall and temple. Eliana stood at the chamber's center, her robes the blue-gray of authority, her eyes the total blue of spice saturation. She radiated Bene Gesserit control, but the Slayer's sensors detected micro-tremors in her hands, the subtle tells of someone who had experienced something that exceeded their training's capacity to process. She spoke before Paul could introduce the stranger, her voice carrying harmonics that would have influenced a normal human's emotional state. Shaigara. The Fremen name suits you, though it captures only part of your truth. You are older than you appear, older than human lifespans allow. I see it in the way you move, the absolute economy that comes only from millennia of refinement. You are what the Bene Gesserit have searched for across 100 generations, the ultimate human. Humanity distilled to a single purpose. She paused, reading his response, finding nothing but patient waiting. But you are also not human anymore. Are you? You were once. I can feel the echo of it, the humanity that was burned away but left its shape behind, like a shadow on stone. Something changed you. Something gave you power and purpose and stripped away everything that would interfere with those gifts. And now you are the weapon. The perfect weapon. The weapon that hell itself cannot stop. The Slayer remained motionless, offering neither confirmation nor denial. His armor's passive sensors analyzed the chamber, mapping exits and angles, identifying potential threats and assets. The tactical part of his mind never stopped, never rested. It was the price of his transformation, the gift and the curse. Eliana stepped closer, near enough that she could have reached out and touched his armor if she dared. I need you to understand what you are fighting, she said. And now the harmonics dropped away, leaving only raw urgency. The spice is conscious, not individually, but as a network. Every grain connected to every other grain through quantum entanglement that we do not fully understand. The sandworms are part of this network. The Fremen who consume spice their entire lives are part of it. Even the guild navigators, transformed by melange saturation, are nodes in a planetary consciousness. And now hell has learned to inject itself into that consciousness. It is possessing the entire network, possessing Arrakis itself. She gestured to a hololithic projection that shimmered to life, showing the spice network as a web of light that covered the entire planet. And within that web, spreading like rot, were nodes of darkness, contamination points, each one a breach where hell had established presence. You have destroyed some of these, Eliana continued, but you cannot destroy them all fast enough. They replicate faster than you can eliminate them, and they are all connected to this. The projection zoomed to a point in the deep desert, far south of any habitation, in the region the Fremen called the False Wall because the geological formations there resembled the Shield Wall but led nowhere. A single massive node pulsed with darkness so concentrated it seemed to drink the light around it. The primary anchor, she said simply. The source from which all other breaches derive, a dimensional wound large enough to allow things through that should not be able to manifest in our reality. We detected it 3 days ago through seismic analysis. It is located 700 meters beneath the sand in a geological formation that should not exist. A cavity, a space that our records say was never there. The Slayer studied the projection, his tactical systems already calculating approach vectors and breach strategies. 700 meters of sand, unstable geology, unknown internal defenses. It would be a descent into hell itself, which was tactically familiar but environmentally novel. He would need specialized equipment, support, extraction planning, or he would need to ensure he did not require extraction. "We can get you there," Paul said, stepping forward to stand beside the projection. "The Fremen have routes through the deep desert that avoid worm territories. We can bring you to the surface coordinates in 3 days of hard riding, but once you descend, you will be beyond our ability to support. The sand will not allow communication. The depth will not allow rescue. You will be alone, Shaigara, as you have always been." The Slayer nodded once. It was acknowledgement, agreement, acceptance of the tactical reality that every significant battle ended with him standing alone against forces that existed to destroy everything he protected. "But there is a problem," Eliana interjected, her voice tight with a fear that her training could not fully suppress. "The primary anchor is not just a breach point, it is a summoning gate. The entities we have detected moving through it are larger than the imps and soldiers you have been destroying, larger than anything our mythology has names for, and they are being directed by an intelligence that knows you are coming, that has been preparing for you. Hell has fought you for eons, Slayer. They have learned how you think, how you fight. They know that you will come to the primary anchor. They want you to come. Because while you are deep beneath the sand, fighting through whatever horrors they have prepared, the surface contamination will continue spreading. The navigators in orbit will continue transforming. The Imperium will continue drinking poisoned spice. She met his gaze directly, using Bene Gesserit training to hold contact with eyes that had seen things that would shatter normal human sanity. "You cannot win by fighting," she said softly. "Not this time. The enemy has made the entire battlefield a trap. Every action you take serves their purpose. Every demon you kill buys them time to corrupt more hosts. You must do something you have never done before. You must not fight. You must think." The Slayer regarded her in silence, processing, calculating. She was correct. The tactical situation presented an impossible dilemma. Engage the primary anchor and leave the surface contamination free to spread. Purge the surface and allow the primary anchor to mature until it could summon entities that would make the surface purge meaningless. Split his attention and achieve neither objective fully. This was how Hell fought when it learned, not with overwhelming force, though it commanded that, not with superior numbers, though it possessed infinite reserves, but with strategy, with manipulation of circumstances until the enemy's own nature became a weapon against them. Hell knew the Slayer would attack, knew he would prioritize the greatest threat, knew he would focus on the primary anchor because that was how you ended invasions, by cutting off the source. And Hell would use that knowledge to complete the corruption of Arrakis while he was buried beneath sand and darkness. But the Slayer had fought impossible tactical situations before, had faced scenarios where every choice led to catastrophe, and had found the third option, the solution that existed in the space between binary decisions. He was not just a weapon. The Seraphim had chosen him for transformation because he possessed something that Hell could never understand, the capacity to adapt, to transcend limitation through absolute refusal to accept defeat. He turned to Paul, and though he did not speak, his intention was clear in the gesture. Paul, with prescient awareness that read intention as clearly as words, understood. "You need time," Paul said, translating for those who lacked his abilities. "Time to reach the primary anchor, to destroy it, and to return before the surface corruption becomes terminal. You need someone to hold the line, to delay Hell's spread across the factories and CH networks, to buy you the days you need to end this at the source. The Slayer nodded. Then you shall have it, Paul replied, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy and acceptance. The Fremen will wage jihad against the corrupted, will purge every factory showing signs of demonic presence. We will burn the spice stores if necessary. We will kill our own people if they become possessed. We will do what must be done, no matter the cost, because if we do not, there will be no Fremen to mourn the sacrifice. He drew his krisk knife, the sacred blade made from the tooth of a sandworm, and held it horizontally across his palms in the gesture of absolute commitment. This is the Fremen way, Shaigara. We do not surrender. We do not compromise. We endure, or we die. And if our deaths buy your victory, then our water will be remembered. Stilgar stepped forward, adding his voice to the oath. The Sietch is yours to command. Our weapons, our knowledge, our lives. Use them to end this darkness. Use them to protect the desert that is our soul. One by one, the Fedaykin in the chamber drew their blades and repeated the gesture, a commitment that transcended tactical alliance. A recognition that this battle would decide not just the fate of Arrakis, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. If Hell claimed the spice network, claimed the consciousness of the Imperium, then humanity's future became an extension of demonic will. Every thought shaped by whispers, every choice guided by corruption, every soul harvested for Hell's endless appetite. The Slayer understood sacrifice, had seen entire civilizations offer themselves to stop Hell's advance, had watched the Night Sentinels stand and die to the last warrior to give him time to reach the Well of Souls, had witnessed the Seraphim's own sacrifice, giving up divinity to grant him the power needed to challenge Hell's hierarchy. Sacrifice was the currency of this war, the only currency that Hell could not devalue or corrupt. He accepted their oath, with a gesture that committed him in return. He would reach the primary anchor, he would destroy it or die in the attempt, and he would do it fast enough that their sacrifice would not be wasted. The chamber fell silent, the weight of what had been promised settling over everyone present. This was the moment that changed everything. The point where Arrakis stopped being a prize to be fought over and became a battlefield in the oldest war, where prophecy and legend collided with something that existed before prophecy had language, where the future Paul saw in his visions bent toward a singularity that even prescience could not predict. 3 days to the false wall, Stilgar said, breaking the silence with tactical necessity. We ride before dawn. Shaigara will need supplies, water, though I suspect he does not consume as we do. Correct, Paul confirmed. His armor sustains him, recycles everything. He is a closed system, perfectly efficient, but he will need weapons resupply, ammunition, power cells, whatever fuels his instruments of war. The Slayer accessed his armor's inventory systems, generating a hololithic readout of his current supply status and projected consumption rates. The display floated in the air, showing ammunition counts for each weapon, argent energy reserves, equipment charges. The Fremen studied it with the attention they gave to water accounting, recognizing that in their own way, these numbers represented life and death as surely as moisture did. We have no way to manufacture these materials, Eliana said, studying the exotic specifications. But the UAC established research stations on Arrakis before the invasion, hidden facilities in the deep desert, meant to study the spice's properties. Some may still be operational. Some may have supplies that your systems can adapt. The Slayer's HUD pinged recognition. UAC facilities. The corporation that had opened the original portals to Hell in its hubris-driven search for unlimited energy, the entity that had caused Mars's fall through greed and ignorance, If UAC had reached Arrakis, had begun experimenting with spice and Argent energy integration, then the current crisis might have been inevitable. Hell followed UAC's footprint across dimensions like a predator tracking blood in water. "There is one facility along the route to the false wall," Paul said, his prescience showing him the path. "Abandoned for 5 years, but still powered. Still broadcasting a maintenance signal that the Fremen learned to ignore. We can stop there, resupply, and perhaps find information about why UAC was interested in Arrakis in the first place." The answer to that question was obvious to anyone who understood Hell's nature. The spice granted prescience. Prescience allowed perception across time, and Hell existed partially outside linear time, its realm touching all moments simultaneously. The spice network was a weak point in dimensional barriers, a place where consciousness reached beyond itself and became vulnerable to external influence. UAC would have seen that vulnerability as an opportunity, would have tried to exploit it, to use the spice as a catalyst for controlled dimensional breach. They would have failed. UAC always failed. But their failures opened doors, and things came through those doors that should have remained sealed forever. The planning continued through the night, tactics and logistics refined by people who understood desert warfare and adapted now to include warfare against an enemy that defied natural law. The Fremen would split into hunting parties, each one targeting known contamination sites, purging them with fire and faith. They would establish quarantine protocols for any Sietch showing signs of possession. They would kill without mercy or hesitation, because mercy against demonic possession was cruelty to those who suffered it. And Paul Atreides would coordinate this campaign with the cold precision of a mentat and the foresight of a prescient, seeing the branching futures and choosing the paths that maximized survival even when all paths led through horror. He was 15 years old. By the time this war ended, if he survived it, he would be ancient in ways that had nothing to do with chronological age. The Slayer spent those hours in meditation that looked like stillness but was actually tactical preparation, his mind running through scenarios and contingencies, his body conserving energy for the battles ahead. He did not sleep, had not truly slept in longer than human reckoning measured. The Praetor suit sustained him beyond normal limitations, and when it could not, his will filled the gap. He had learned to exist in a state of permanent readiness, always 1 second from violence, always prepared for Hell's next manifestation. Dawn came cold and sharp, the desert stars fading into pale blue sky. The war party assembled in the Sietch's main cavern, 30 Fedaykin mounted on desert equipment, carrying weapons both traditional and scavenged from Harkonnen defeats. They wore their still suits with practiced ease, water discipline so ingrained it was autonomic, and they carried now an additional burden, the knowledge that they rode not to raid factories or ambush patrols but to wage war against literal demons. Some prayed to Shai Hulud. Some chanted the Fremen battle litanies. All checked their weapons with the thoroughness of those who knew they might not return. The Slayer rode in a reinforced carrier that groaned under his mass, his weapons secured but ready for immediate deployment. Paul rode beside the carrier on a captured Harkonnen cycle, his blue eyes scanning the horizon with awareness that went beyond vision. And Stilgar led from the front, his authority absolute, his presence a stabilizing force for warriors who faced the unknown. They departed Sietch Tabor as the sun cleared the eastern dunes, riding into the deep desert where only Fremen dared travel, where the sand held secrets that predated human presence on Arrakis. The journey would take 3 days if nothing went wrong, 4 if they encountered complications, 5 if the demons had learned to hunt in the open desert. Behind them, the Sietch began its transformation into a fortress, sealing entrances, establishing interior watchpoints, preparing for siege from enemies that might manifest from within rather than without. Reverend Mother Ileana coordinated this effort with the efficiency of Bene Gesserit training, her other memory providing templates from 1,000 similar crises across human history. But nothing in those memories matched this exactly. Nothing prepared her for the reality of fighting an enemy that attacked through the substance that defined her world. She stood at the Sietch's highest observation point, watching the war party vanish into the shimmering heat, and wondered if she would ever see any of them again. Wondered if Shai Gara truly was the salvation the Fremen believed him to be, or if he was just another weapon that would break against Hell's infinite patience. Only time would answer. And time was the resource they could least afford to spend. The first day of travel passed without incident, the war party making good progress across terrain that would have killed untrained travelers in hours. They rode in silence, conserving moisture and energy, speaking only when tactical necessity demanded it. The Slayer's sensors detected no demonic presence in the open desert, but the background contamination of the spice network registered as a constant irritation, a low-level infection that pervaded everything. They camped that night in the shelter of a rock formation, establishing watch rotations and rationing water with religious precision. Paul sat beside the Slayer's position, studying the armored figure with the intensity of one trying to solve an equation written in a language he did not speak. "You have fought this war for a long time," Paul said quietly. "Not really a question. Longer than human lifespans, longer than civilizations. How do you maintain purpose across that duration? How do you not lose yourself in the violence?" The Slayer did not respond, but something in his stillness suggested he had heard, had processed the question, even if he had no answer that could be spoken. "I see futures," Paul continued. "Millions of them. Branching possibilities that stretch across centuries. And in almost all of them, I become something terrible. A prophet whose name launches a holy war that drowns the stars in blood. A tyrant whose rule becomes indistinguishable from the oppression it replaced. I see what I will become, and I do not know how to avoid it. Because every choice that prevents one horror enables another." He paused, looking up at the stars that burned with cold indifference above the desert. "But you," Paul said, "you have chosen one path and walked it for eons. You have become the weapon, the perfect instrument of destruction. And somehow you have not become the monster. Somehow you have maintained the distinction between slaughter and justice. I need to understand how, because I fear that my own path leads to a place where that distinction no longer exists." The Slayer turned his head fractionally, regarding the boy who spoke with the voice of one who had seen his own damnation written in probability and destiny. And for the first time since arriving on Arrakis, the Slayer made a gesture that was not tactical. He raised one hand and touched the center of his chest plate, where beneath armor and enhancement, the heart that had once been fully human still beat with stubborn persistence. The message was clear. Remember what you fight for. Not victory, not glory, not destiny, but the people who suffer if you fail, the ones who cannot fight for themselves. The children who die if you surrender. The future that deserves to exist even if you will never see it. That was what separated slaughter from justice. That was what made rage holy instead of monstrous. That single commitment, maintained across eons, to protect those who could not protect themselves. Paul understood, felt understanding settle into his bones like cold water. His prescience showed him futures where he kept that commitment and futures where he lost it in the complexities of politics and power. The choice was his. The path was his. And knowing that choice existed was what preserved the humanity that prophecy threatened to consume. "Thank you," Paul said simply, and meant it with a depth that went beyond politeness or formality. They spoke no more that night. The stars wheeled overhead. The desert breathed its ancient rhythms, and in the distance, faint and growing, the sound of drums began to echo across the sand. Not the thumping of maker hooks calling worms, not the mechanical pulse of Harkonnen equipment, but something else. Something that beat with the rhythm of Hell's heart, calling its forces to manifestation. The war was accelerating. and they still had 2 days to reach the false wall. 2 days that hell would fill with everything it could summon to stop them.